October, I was failing my son, and I knew it. Not in any dramatic way. No one was shouting, no doors were slamming. It was quieter than that. It was the third time in 2 weeks I'd sat across from him at his kitchen table while he pretended not to notice I was counting the pill bottles on the counter. 17. He had 17 prescription bottles lined up like little orange soldiers along the windowsill, and he was 53 years old, and none of that was supposed to happen to my boy. I'm 67, retired. I spent 31 years as a social worker for the province of Ontario, and I thought that meant I knew something about hardship, about people at the end of their rope, but nothing in those 31 years prepared me for sitting across from my own child and realizing I couldn't fix it. His name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that he had a degenerative spinal condition that had taken his career, his marriage, and most of his savings in the space of 4 years. What matters is that the specialist in Toronto, the only one in the country doing the procedure he needed, had a wait time of 8 months through OHIP, but could see him privately in 6 weeks. What matters is that the private surgical cost was $280,000, and I had $62,000 in my RRSP and a pension that covered my rent and groceries with about $400 left over every month. I did the math in my car before I drove home. I sat in his driveway for 20 minutes doing arithmetic on my phone like I was back in high school. It didn't work out, no matter how many times I tried. I drove back to my apartment in Guelph. I fed my cat. I stood at the kitchen window for a long time looking at the parking lot below. The way the sodium lights turned everything a particular shade of amber that always made me feel like I was looking at the world from inside a snow globe. Preserved, distant, like the real life was happening somewhere else and I was just watching through the glass. I don't know what made me open my laptop. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I think I just couldn't stand the silence anymore. I found the listing through a legal services forum, of all places. Someone had posted a link in a thread about elder law in Ontario, a thread I'd stumbled onto while looking up something about power of attorney. The link was to a private agency, discreet was the word they used, over and over, that facilitated what they called structured companionship arrangements for individuals of significant means who required a domestic partner for specific legal or personal purposes. A fixed term, a contract, compensation at the end. I read the page 3 times. Then I closed the laptop, made myself a cup of chamomile tea, drank the whole thing standing at the counter, and opened the laptop again. I was a social worker. I knew exactly what that kind of language could sometimes dress up, so I read it a 4th time, more carefully. There was a professional consultation component. References were checked on both sides. The arrangements would register a family law firm in Ottawa. The agency had been operating for 11 years. There was a testimonial from a retired professor in Halifax who described it as an unconventional solution to an unconventional problem. That phrase stayed with me. That was exactly what I had, an unconventional problem. I didn't submit an inquiry that night. I made myself wait a week. I called my oldest friend, a woman I'd known since Teachers College who now lived in Victoria, and I told her in very general terms that I was considering something unusual to help my son, and she said, "How unusual?" And I said, "Marriage unusual." And she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Tell me everything." She didn't talk me out of it. That surprised me. She said, "You spent your whole career helping strangers. Maybe it's okay to let a stranger help you for once." I submitted the inquiry the following Tuesday. The consultation was conducted over video call with a woman from the agency who had the kind of manner I associated with estate lawyers. Precise, warm in a professional way, completely unshockable. She explained that they had a client, a man in his late 60s, who had specific reasons for seeking a short-term legal arrangement. He was private. He lived alone on a property outside of Perth, Ontario. He had no family in Canada. The arrangement would require cohabitation for 10 months, after which a mutual dissolution would be arranged through the family law firm. The compensation was $300,000, paid in 2 installments. I asked what the reasons were. She said she couldn't share details before a mutual agreement to proceed, but that she could tell me he had been thoroughly vetted, that he had no criminal record, no history of violence, and that 2 previous agency clients had provided character references for him. I asked why he needed this. She paused, the first pause she'd had in the whole call, and said, "He needs a witness." I didn't know what that meant. I said so. She said, "That's something he prefers to explain himself." I agreed to an in-person meeting. His name was Wallace. Not a name you hear much anymore. His mother had been Scottish. I learned that later. The day I met him, I learned almost nothing, because Wallace was the most contained human being I had ever encountered. And I say that having spent 3 decades in interview rooms with people who had every reason in the world to keep their mouths shut. He met me at the door of his house, a stone farmhouse, 2 stories, set back from a gravel lane lined with old maples, the kind of property that had clearly been maintained by someone who found the work itself meaningful, rather than just necessary. He was tall, grey-haired, close-cropped. He wore a dark wool sweater and, despite the mildness of the October afternoon, leather gloves. He offered me coffee. He did not offer to shake hands. I noticed the gloves immediately, the way you notice something that isn't quite wrong, but isn't quite right either. I didn't say anything. He brought coffee in proper cups, not mugs, and set them on the kitchen table, and we sat across from each other in the particular silence of 2 people who have agreed to be honest and aren't sure yet where to start. He spoke first. He said, "I'll tell you why I need this, because you deserve to know before you make any decision, and then I'll answer whatever questions you have, and I'd rather you ask them plainly." I said that sounded fair. He explained, been estranged from his only living relative, a younger brother in Scotland, for 22 years over a matter that had started as a business dispute and calcified into something harder. His brother had been diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's 3 years earlier and had recently entered a care facility in Edinburgh. Their estrangement had been formally documented. Wallace had been removed from his brother's affairs, and a cousin he barely knew had been appointed substitute decision-maker. His brother had a daughter. A niece Wallace had never been allowed to know. The brother's condition had progressed faster than expected. There was a question of what would happen to the niece, who was 17, whose mother had died when she was small, whose father was now unable to advocate for her. Wallace wanted to be considered in any guardianship or trustee proceedings. He had consulted a family law specialist in Edinburgh, and the specialist had told him that his estrangement and his solitary lifestyle were significant obstacles. He was perceived as reclusive and disconnected. Having a spouse, a real person who lived with him, who could speak to his character and his capacity for relationship, would meaningfully affect how the Scottish courts viewed him. 10 months, until the court proceedings concluded. Then a civil dissolution, clean, documented, $300,000. I asked him why he hadn't simply reached out to his brother years ago. He looked at me for a moment, and something in his face shifted, not much, just a degree or 2, and he said, "I tried. 3 years ago, when I heard about the diagnosis, he wouldn't see me. He'd been told a version of events that wasn't accurate, and by the time I understood that, he was already losing the ability to process new information." He looked down at his coffee cup. "I couldn't correct the record with him, so I'm trying to correct it another way." That was the moment I understood he wasn't a difficult man. He was a grieving one. I said I needed a few days. He said, of course. I drove back to Guelph and called my son and told him there might be a way to get the money for the surgery. He said, "Mum, what did you do?" And I said, "Nothing yet. I'm thinking." He said, "Please don't do anything that hurts you." I had to put the phone down for a moment. I signed the agreement on a Wednesday. I moved to the farmhouse outside Perth on the 1st of November. The first 2 weeks were the strangest thing I had ever lived through. and I had worked in family services for 3 decades, so that is saying something. We were polite, careful. We moved around each other in that stone kitchen like two people sharing a space on a train, aware of each other, making accommodations, not yet at ease. He cooked. I hadn't expected that. He made things slowly and with attention, soups with actual stock, bread on Sundays, a beef stew one evening that smelled so much like my mother's kitchen that I had to leave the room for a minute under the pretense of checking my phone. He noticed, I think. He didn't say anything. He was always wearing the gloves inside. That was the thing I kept coming back to. Thin leather inside, thicker wool ones for outside. I could see they weren't decorative. The leather ones were worn at the fingertips, practical, clearly habitual. A few times I caught myself watching his hands while he cooked, the way he managed a knife or lifted a pot, and I wondered what the gloves were protecting or hiding, or both. I didn't ask. It wasn't my place. We had an arrangement, not a friendship, and I understood that distinction. By December, we had settled into a kind of routine. I walked in the mornings. The property backed onto a conservation area, and there were trails through birch stands that were extraordinary in the frost. He was an early riser too, though he worked in his study until mid-morning. We ate lunch together almost every day, and that was when we started to actually talk. Not about the arrangement, about other things. He had opinions about municipal politics that were sharp and funny. He'd lived in Aberdeen and then Vancouver, and then for 15 years in a small town in New Brunswick before moving to Perth. He'd been an architect. The farmhouse had been his design, built 12 years ago on land he'd bought when the rest of his life had fallen quiet. I told him about the years in family services, about the cases that stayed with me, the ones that still came to me at odd moments. Not the dramatic ones, but the small ones, the quiet ones, a child who'd drawn a picture once that I'd carried in my work bag for 6 years before I finally let myself throw it away. He listened the way people who are actually interested listen, which is differently from how people who are being polite listen. I noticed that. He asked me once why I'd become a social worker. I said, because I was good at sitting with things that were hard. He looked at me for a moment and then nodded, just once, and said, yes, I can see that. I thought about that for days. There was an evening in January, a proper Ontario January, -22 outside, the kind of cold that makes the house settle and creak, when I woke up at 2 a.m. to a sound I couldn't immediately place, a thud, then nothing, then what sounded like something being knocked over. It was coming from his study at the end of the hall. I got up. I stood outside the door for a moment, listening. Another sound, low, the kind a person makes when they're trying not to make any sound. I knocked. Nothing. I said his name. After a moment he said, I'm fine. He didn't sound fine. I opened the door. He was on the floor beside his desk, half sitting, half leaning against the bookcase. He'd knocked over a lamp, which was lying sideways on the rug, still casting light at a strange angle. He was holding his right hand against his chest, and his gloves were off. And I saw his hands. I have thought many times since then about what I expected to see. I don't know. I think somewhere in the back of my mind I'd constructed something dramatic. A scar, perhaps, something visible and striking. I wasn't prepared for what his hands actually looked like, which was damaged in a way that was quiet and chronic and clearly very painful. His fingers were significantly disfigured by what I recognized immediately from my years doing intake assessments with industrial workers as severe burn scarring. Not fresh, old, healed, textured. The kind of scarring that happens when a burn heals without the benefit of modern reconstructive surgery, when the skin contracts and the joints stiffen and the person learns to live with what works and what doesn't. He looked at me, looking at his hands. He had the expression of someone who had prepared for this moment many times and still found the reality of it unwelcome. I sat down on the floor across from him. He didn't say anything. I said, "Can you put weight on it?" Or did you hit the wrist when you fell? He blinked. He said, "The wrist." I said, "Let me see." He held out his hand. I checked the wrist. Not broken, likely a sprain, tender on the lateral side. I told him as much. He said, "You were a nurse." I said, "Social worker." But I did a medical first aid certification every 2 years for 31 years. I've seen sprains. I looked at him. "We should wrap it. Do you have a tensor bandage?" He said there was one in the bathroom cabinet. I wrapped his wrist. He sat at his desk chair, and I sat on the footstool he used when he read, and neither of us said anything for a while. The lamp was still on the floor. The light in the room had the tilted quality of something interrupted. He said eventually, "It was a fire, 25 years ago, a building site in New Brunswick. I pulled a man out and I didn't have time to think about my hands." He paused. "I've never told anyone that wasn't already in a medical file." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because people try to make it into something it isn't. Something heroic or tragic. It was just something that happened quickly, and I made a choice." He looked at his hands. "I wear the gloves because the scarring makes people uncomfortable, and because I've had enough of watching people not know where to look." I understood that. I understood it in a specific bone-deep way that had nothing to do with architecture or legal arrangements or Scottish family courts. I had spent 30 years watching people navigate the particular indignity of being looked at, being assessed, being made into a story. He wasn't a story. He was a man who had done something decent in a moment of crisis and had been marked by it ever since, and who had decided the simplest solution was to make himself invisible. I said, "I know where to look." He looked at me. I said, "I've been in this house for 3 months. I know exactly where to look." The court proceedings in Edinburgh happened in March. I gave a statement by video conference to the family law assessor. Not a script, not coached, just what I knew of him from having lived alongside him since November. I spoke about his routine and his character and the way he'd handled a difficult and unusual situation with more integrity than most people manage in straightforward ones. I spoke about the bread on Sundays and the conservation trail and the beef stew that smelled like my mother's kitchen. The assessor asked me how I would describe his capacity for a relationship. I thought for a moment. I said, "He's the kind of person who notices when something is hard for you and doesn't make you talk about it. I find that increasingly rare." He was granted a role in his niece's care arrangements. Not sole guardianship. The Scottish courts were measured about that, given the estrangement and the distance, but he was formally recognised as a significant person in her life, with rights to contact and a seat at the table in decisions about her welfare. He flew to Edinburgh in April. He called me from there the night before he met her for the first time. He said, "I don't know what to say to her." I said, "You'll ask her what's hard, and you'll listen." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Right." Our arrangement ended officially on the 15th of May. The dissolution paperwork was filed through the Ottawa law firm exactly as agreed. The second instalment of the compensation was deposited the following week. I drove to Toronto and handed my son a certified bank draft, and he looked at it for a long time, and then he looked at me and I said, "Don't. We're not doing the part where you feel guilty. You're getting the surgery, and that's the end of it." He had the surgery in June. He walked without assistance for the first time in 4 years at the end of August. He called me from his physiotherapy appointment, and I could hear that he was crying, and I stood in my kitchen in Guelph. New apartment, nicer neighbourhood. I'd moved in May, and I held the phone to my ear and listened to him breathe and didn't say anything at all, because there wasn't anything to say that was adequate. Wallace and I exchange emails. Not often. He's not an often kind of person, and neither am I anymore. He sends me photographs sometimes of the conservation trail in different seasons, and twice now of his niece, who is studying architectural design in Edinburgh and who, in the photographs, looks like someone who has found something to run toward. He came to Guelph for a weekend in September. We walked along the Speed River and he wore the gloves, the leather ones, and partway through the walk, he said, "I've been thinking about something." I said, "What's that?" He said, "I'm not sure I want to keep explaining why I wear these." I said, "You don't have to explain anything. You never did." He looked at me for a moment. Then he took them off and put them in his jacket pocket, and we walked the rest of the way along the river in the late September light and talked about nothing important and everything that mattered. I don't know what this is exactly. I'm 67. He's 68. We are two people who came to each other through a transaction and discovered, slowly and without any particular intention, that the transaction was not the point. I know what I feel. I've spent 67 years learning to trust that. I've been sitting with this story for a while now, trying to figure out what it actually taught me. Not the tidy version, not the kind of lesson you'd write on a card. The real one, the one that took months to settle into something I could name. I think it starts with this. I made a decision that looked from the outside like desperation, and maybe it was. But desperation isn't always the opposite of good judgment. Sometimes it's just what clarity feels like when you've run out of comfortable options. I knew what I valued. I knew what I was willing to do to protect it, and I moved toward that, even when it was uncomfortable, even when I couldn't see how it would end. That, I've come to understand, is not recklessness. That's a kind of integrity, the kind that doesn't wait for ideal conditions. Wallace taught me something about that too, without meaning to. He'd spent 22 years carrying a version of himself that other people had written for him, the difficult one, the reclusive one, the man who couldn't be trusted with relationship. And he hadn't dissolved into that story. He'd quietly, stubbornly kept working towards something real, something that mattered, a chance to know his niece, to be part of her life, to correct what had gone wrong without being able to undo it. That takes a particular kind of intelligence. Not the kind measured in credentials, but the kind that can look at a complicated situation honestly and figure out what's actually true versus what's just been repeated long enough to feel true. He'd done that work alone, in a stone farmhouse outside Perth, for years before I ever arrived. And the gloves. I keep coming back to the gloves. He wore them because he'd learned that his hands made people uncomfortable, that they didn't know where to look, that they'd turn his story into something he hadn't consented to. So he made a practical decision: cover what causes problems, keep moving. There's something in that I recognize. Not hiding exactly, more like choosing which battles to fight, which exposures are necessary, and which ones just cost you energy you need elsewhere. That's its own kind of wisdom, even if it's also lonely. What I didn't expect was that the arrangement would ask something of me beyond the practical. I'd thought I was signing up to be a character witness and a housemate. What it actually required was that I show up day after day as someone real, someone with 31 years of hard work and a cat and a son I would do anything for, and a need for chamomile tea at 10 o'clock at night. It required me to be present without an agenda, and I found, somewhere in those 10 months of Sunday bread and conservation trails and January silences, that presence itself is not a passive thing. It's a choice you make over and over. It's what trust is actually built from. My son walked unassisted in August. Wallace met his niece in April. I moved into a nicer apartment in May. These things didn't happen by accident. They happened because people made hard choices with the information they had, held to what they knew was right even when it was awkward and unconventional and sometimes frightening, and kept going anyway. That's what I want to carry forward, not the drama of it. The steady part, the part where you decide who you are, and you just keep being that, even in a stranger's house, even at 2 a.m, even on a floor beside a fallen lamp. That's the only thing I know for certain.